Please note that please note that CLEs are not being offered for this event. So our two panelists for today, our guest panelists are Emily Hamilton, who is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's also the director of the Urbanity Institute. We also have Adam Gordon, who is a executive director at the Fair Share Housing Center in New Jersey, so across the river, I guess. And without further ado, we will allow our panelists to give their presentations, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm going to talk about the relationship between land use restrictions and housing affordability in U.S. cities today. I think the clicker might not be working. Do I need to turn it on? It's on. Not yet.
I can do it manually.
Or I can just switch spots with you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I'll talk first about a very brief overview of how land use regulations typically work and how they constrain housing supply and in turn make housing more expensive than it would otherwise be. Then I'll turn to some recent reforms that have been implemented at the local and state level to try to address these problems. And finally, I'll talk about inclusionary zoning, which is an area where I think Adam and I will have a little bit of debate about the outcome of some of these land use policies. So I'll talk first about what a well-functioning housing market looks like and how a well-functioning housing market can deliver broad-based affordability. I have this hermit crab slide here because it's actually a really helpful analogy for understanding how market rate housing can deliver broad-based affordability. So when hermit crabs grow, they move into larger shells as they get bigger and bigger. And to make this an efficient process, you can actually see hermit crabs line up on a beach, smallest to largest, to do like a group move where each one moves into the next larger shell. Similarly, when new housing is delivered, new construction tends to be at a relatively high price point compared to older comparable housing. But when a new apartment building or a new subdivision opens up that's typically pretty high end for the market at the time, it will lead to many people from other parts of that housing market moving into the new building. And in turn, they're freeing up other lower cost units throughout the region. So a new apartment building or a new subdivision sets off a chain reaction of moves where higher income households tend to be moving into that new construction housing, but in turn that creates the opportunity for lower income households to move into housing that better meets their needs as well. Lots of land use regulations, however, stand in the way of this filtering process, and in particular stand in the way of market rate housing construction serving low-income households. We can think of land use regulations in a very broad generality affecting the construction of multifamily housing and single-family housing. So when we're thinking about what stands in the way of multifamily housing construction, the most important is zoning that designates the majority of land in most U.S. cities for exclusively single-family housing. So an apartment building like this would be permitted on a tiny portion of the typical U.S. locality's land. On top of that zoning, there are lots of regulations that limit the supply of multifamily housing and make it more expensive than it would otherwise be. including parking requirements, which are very expensive to meet when land is expensive, height limits, and other restrictions on the density of multifamily housing in the small areas where it's permitted. Then when we think about how zoning affects the single-family market, the most important regulation at the highest level is typically minimum lot size requirements that require each single-family house to sit on a yard of a certain size. And of course, that directly increases the cost of those single-family houses, particularly in places where land is expensive, and puts a cap on the number of single-family houses that can fit into a single-family zoning district. So all of these zoning rules broadly limit the amount of housing that can be built in a locality, and in turn create problems for housing affordability. In particular, single-family zoning has a history of being intentionally implemented as a racist tool of exclusion in the U.S. Coming out of the Buchanan v. Worley case, localities adopted single-family zoning in many cases explicitly stating that this economic policy that would set a cap on how expensive new construction would be would have the effect of segregating cities by race as well as by income. And so in part because of that reason, there's been a lot of focus on reforming single-family zoning in particular. Under these land use regulations that cover the U.S. today, there are severe affordability problems, of course, most concentrated in high-income coastal cities. But across the country, half of households that rent meet the government's definition of rent burdened, meaning they spend 30% or more of their income on rent, in many cases leaving them without enough income left over to meet their other needs. The costs of land use regulations are greatest for low-income households living in high-cost cities. That's where we see the direct effects of land use restrictions and housing affordability problems. But they also have widespread economy-wide consequences. When localities that are real centers of innovation and high-wage jobs put a cap on the number of people that their housing markets can accommodate, we see less innovation and less economic productivity than we would expect to see if as many people as wanted to were able to move to regions like the Bay Area, New York City, wherever their best economic opportunities might be located. All right, turning now to recent local and state reforms to exclusionary zoning. As I mentioned, there has been a ton of focus in the past few years on reforming single-family zoning. Minneapolis has been a case that's gotten some of the most widespread media for its single-family zoning reform. In 2019, the city adopted triplex zoning to replace single-family zoning across the city, meaning that 3 units could be built where only 1 was permitted previously. So this sounds like a huge deal, and it has gotten tons of coverage as a result. But there has been very little permitting of duplexes and triplexes in Minneapolis in the past couple of years. And that's because the details of land use reform are really important. So Minneapolis, as I said, changed from single-family zoning to triplex zoning. But these 2 houses are an example of a duplex and a triplex that were built prior to Minneapolis adopting any zoning at all. Neither would be allowed to be built under the city's new triplex zoning because they're too large, they're too close to their lot lines, and they're too big. So the remaining restrictions in Minneapolis that limit how big a duplex or triplex can be are a really important barrier to actually getting those new units built, even though on paper the city seems to have made it much easier to build lower cost, denser housing relative to its prior single family zoning. We can compare this Minneapolis reform to a Houston minimum lot size reform that was implemented in 1998 within Houston's I-610 loop and later expanded to cover the entire city. Houston's never had single-family zoning, but it still does have minimum lot size requirements that limit how small a lot with a house on it can be. But this 1998 reform reduced the minimum lot size requirement from 5,000 square feet down to effectively 1,400 square feet. So like the Minneapolis case, this reform permits 3 houses to be built where only 1 was allowed previously. But Houston has seen a ton of townhouse construction as a result of this reform, whereas the Minneapolis change has not so far led to much construction at all. And this is because under the Houston reform, very large townhouses are allowed to be built on these small lots, which has been a solution that works well for home builders, for home buyers, and has led to a lot of construction, whereas the triplex reform hasn't been something that's led to a lot of opportunities that work out in the housing market. At the state level, as at the local level, there's been a lot of focus on single-family zoning reform, but at the state level, what we've seen a lot of is preemption of accessory dwelling unit bans at the local level. So state policymakers have come in to say that within single-family zoning districts across their states, localities must permit homeowners to allow to build something like this backyard cottage example here, basement apartments or garage apartments that would have otherwise been banned in many cases under local zoning. Again, the details are really important when it comes to what type of policy will actually make it feasible for homeowners to build a lot of ADUs. And we've seen a lot of experimentation at the local and state levels with rules that either make it workable or unworkable for these ADUs to be an important part of new housing construction. All right, finally I'll turn to inclusionary zoning. And as its name indicates, inclusionary zoning is intended to be a remedy for these exclusionary zoning rules that limit housing construction and increase the price of housing across the U.S. Inclusionary zoning has really gained in popularity over the past few decades. And what it means is basically that a certain percentage of new housing units that are delivered in a new project have to be made available at some price below the market rate. So for example, a 100-unit apartment building might be required to have 10 units that are affordable to households making, say, 80% of that region's median income. And the theory of inclusionary zoning is pretty cut and dry. This is from Bob Ellickson's classic paper on inclusionary zoning, and he frames it as a tax on housing construction that will lead to a reduced supply of new construction relative to what a market would have otherwise seen, resulting in the supply curve shifting left, as we see here, and more expensive market rate prices than what the locality would otherwise expect. So we think of an inclusionary zoning program that's very basic like that as just being a tax on new construction that leads to fewer opportunities for those people who are in market rate units, but benefiting the percentage of renters or home buyers who get to get those relatively small portion of subsidized units. But in reality, inclusionary zoning programs tend to be a bit more complex than that. They come with density bonuses that are intended to offset some of that cost to developers of providing the below market rate units. And there have been a few studies looking at the effect of these more complex real world inclusionary zoning programs on housing market outcomes. I studied it in the Baltimore, Washington region. And there have been mixed results. I find in the Baltimore-Washington region that inclusionary zoning programs have led to higher market rate prices in spite of those density bonuses relative to what a locale could have expected without that inclusionary zoning program. But that density bonus does make the theoretical effect certainly ambiguous. But I would argue that inclusionary zoning can never be a remedy to exclusionary zoning, because what gives that density bonus value is exclusionary zoning itself. So if we're talking about a market where home builders are permitted to build as much housing as they think is profitable, that density bonus offers them no benefit because they're already building as much, as densely, at as low of a cost as they think makes sense. So inclusionary zoning can never unwind exclusionary zoning, because without exclusionary zoning, it's a clear tax on housing construction, leading to higher market rate prices for the majority of households who will be in those market rate units. I'll leave it there for now. Look forward to our discussion and your questions. Thanks a lot.
Great. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm really excited about the joint sponsorship of this event. I think this is actually an area where there's a lot of commonality and also differences between people who otherwise often have very different political views and philosophies. And so I'll say that I agree with probably 3/4 of what Emily said in terms of the problem, but I disagree, especially in terms of inclusionary zoning, in terms of the solution. And I guess before I get to the slides, I think the challenge with a purely deregulatory agenda around land use, which we need a lot more of the kinds of removals of barriers that Emily was talking about. And and I agree 100%. I thought Emily's presentation in terms of the recent reforms was spot on. The devil really is in the details. You can have these things like Minneapolis that sound really flashy, but if you really look at it, it doesn't actually get rid of the barriers, and you really need to focus on what the real barriers are. I think that the basic question about what remedy you're looking for to these issues, and I'll go back to the hermit crab analogy, which I thought was a good one. What we really have is a system in which you have some hermit crabs that start with a bunch of spare shells, and other hermit crabs, people who start without that because of the historic racial discrimination in zoning, which has created a huge racial wealth gap. And so if you only have a deregulatory agenda without addressing that, what you end up with is that you have the people who start with the shells, who are most white home buyers in the United States, have help in buying their first home from their family, where only 10% of black home buyers do. And that's that generational wealth that's passed down. So if you have a purely deregulatory agenda, what you end up with is the new housing still is going to the people who start with the most, and that is physically segregated from, yes, it does impact the other communities, but that means that still is segregating people in terms of schools, access to opportunities, and transportation. And I think that there's a basic question about whether that is a fair system, and I think a well-designed inclusionary zoning system is one strategy that helps address that. I also think that there's a sort of I obviously come from a very different background. I'm a practicing attorney. I run a nonprofit that works on these issues in New Jersey and nationally. And I think there's a practical political reality that in places that practice exclusionary zoning, the chances of just totally getting rid of zoning are basically zero. And what we've been able to do in New Jersey, and I think other states that have worked at this, is have a political coalition between, basically groups that are focused on these generational inequities, largely driven by race in the housing market, and the developers and others that have an interest in building more housing. And there's a trade-off, and that political coalition is able to create more housing, including inclusive housing, to get above the barrier of exclusionary zoning in a way that I think neither of those interests would be able to do on their own. And so, it's in a theoretical way great to say we want everywhere to be like Houston. That is never going to happen in most of the United States. I also think that there's ways in which Houston has a lot of good things about it, but there's also ways in which it's not an ideal model. So where's the clicker thing on this? Oh, there, it's there right there. Sorry, let's look at that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Mount Laurel. Anyone here from New Jersey? I always like to ask those. Where are people from? Just shout out.
Atlantic City?
What town?
Longport?
Longport, yeah. Where else? Where?
Ridgewood?
Ridgewood, okay.
Princeton.
Princeton. Give an example from Princeton in this.
Bloomfield?
Bloomfield.
Montville.
Montville. Okay, yeah. And anyone know about anything about Mount Laurel from growing up? Or know whether you have affordable housing in your town as a result of it? So other than Longport, every town that's mentioned has affordable housing in it because of Mount Laurel, and that's a pretty incredible thing. You know, people don't necessarily know that, right? I mean, it's sort of an incredible thing. But Mount Laurel requires every town in the state of New Jersey to allow for its fair share, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is, of affordable housing, and change its land use and other zoning constraints in order to make it realistically possible for that housing to be created. And so I'll talk about a little bit how that came up, what the result is, and also I'm going to end with some examples of what's been done as a result, including some in inclusionary zoning. And I'm going to talk in a more concrete way about some of the issues I was just raising. All right, where does this come from? So New Jersey, people don't often think about this, but New Jersey, like where we are right now, are just above the Mason-Dixon line. Southern New Jersey was a historic center of the Underground Railroad, and Southern New Jersey had a lot of rural black communities that largely came out of the Underground Railroad that were basically threatened by suburbanization in the 60s and 70s, driven by white flight from cities like Camden. And one of those communities, which is about 30 miles from where we are now, is Mount Laurel. And in that community, there was a group of black community leaders centered around this church, which is the oldest AME church in New Jersey, that had figured out how to get funding from HUD to build 36 garden apartments to replace basically dilapidated, largely chicken coops that the people in the community were living in. And the mayor of the town came to the church and said, if you people can't afford to live in our town, you'll just have to leave. Basically said, hey, our zoning doesn't permit garden apartments. It's too bad that you have this funding, but we don't allow that through our zoning. We require a lot of the things that Emily was talking about, bigger lot sizes, bigger setbacks, all those kinds of things. So those community leaders, working with the local NAACP, working also with community groups in Camden, and legal services lawyers, sued Mount Laurel Township in a case that went to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And the New Jersey Supreme Court held that every town in New Jersey has to provide for a realistic opportunity of its fair share, and we'll talk about what that is, of affordable housing, and change its zoning regulations to do so. And really, basically, there was a system put in place through the court decisions and a statute and agency that was passed. And in the 80s and 90s, something pretty incredible happened as a result. Unlike pretty much every other state in that time period that had exclusionary zoning, if you look at the sort of combined bars in the 80s and 90s, New Jersey saw home prices increase basically and rents increase over those 2 decades at the same rate as incomes, which is what you would basically expect would likely happen in a functioning market. So, we got what you would expect from a sort of a deregulatory system, but with all these added benefits that I'll talk about in terms of actually making sure that the housing that was produced was inclusive. And then, and I won't get into the details, I'm happy to in questions and answers, but basically there were a few governors of both parties. We've had people of both parties who've been good on this issue, and we've people of both parties who've been bad on this issue. From 2000 to 2015, who took various steps to stop the enforcement of Mount Laurel. And what happened? Home prices rose at 3 times the rate of incomes, and rents at 2 times the rate of incomes. And obviously there can be lots of other factors, but as a basic perspective, we saw that there was a huge impact on the housing market overall when Mount Laurel was working, and when it didn't, we had what you would expect from exclusionary zoning, which is that if you limit the supply of housing and more people keep moving in, you're just going to have a continual bidding up of housing prices. So what's happened since then is that the New Jersey Supreme Court in 2015 basically said, finally, it's obvious these state agencies that were tasked with enforcing this are not enforcing the state requirements. And for those of you who've taken administrative law, there's this concept of exhaustion of administrative remedies where you have to go to an agency first. Basically, the state Supreme Court said, there's no agency that's functioning. So you don't have to exhaust remedies. Anyone, groups like ours, developers, can go and sue municipalities in court. Municipalities can also affirmatively submit a plan to keep from being sued, which is a fairly unusual feature of New Jersey's law, but one that I think has been very effective, and talk about why that is. And so there were, all of a sudden, we have all these tiny municipalities that all have their own zoning authority. And basically, 350 of our municipalities went to court in some way or were sued. And the courts took this a lot more seriously than the state agencies have. And as a result, there are about 340 municipalities in New Jersey, including almost all the ones that were mentioned. People grew up in. Longport is a tiny, tiny town that doesn't have almost any development, so that's an exception. But basically, that now have these plans where they've had to significantly rezone their zoning ordinances. And what does that mean? The good thing about our case law is that a lot of the things that Emily was rightfully focusing on, that if you say that, for example, oh, we're going to permit triplexes, but you don't actually realistically make it possible. We have very strong case law that focuses on two things. One, there's a concept called realistic opportunity, where there's an actual review by the court, and the court often appoints planners that are special masters to look at the ordinances and make sure that it's not a smokescreen, that you actually can fit what is proposed realistically and with reasonable costs on there. The second point, and this is where things often also get tripped up in these laws, is really that there's a standards around review by planning boards, permitting reviews. If you have a use that's permitted by the zoning from this fair share system, basically a municipality has to provide it with expedited review, and ultimately they basically have to approve it. The point is that there's already been a review of the zoning, and you can't go in, because often the death of proposals is you come in and all of a sudden there's a review in which someone says, oh well, I think that there should be more parking here, or and all those things. There's very specific legal standards to expedite review of development. And so basically, if you say that you're going to do something to meet your obligation, you have to follow through on it. So I'm not going to get into the lack of time, but basically, this is Mount Laurel's agreement as to how to resolve their fair share obligations. There's numbers in terms of the number of affordable units they have to rehabilitate and create. And then there's a chart of how they're going to do it, which is then translated to actual ordinance language. And you can sort of see from here, a lot of this is inclusionary development, and I agree entirely with Emily. It's really important to look at the underlying density, and there's significant upzonings that go along with this. There's some that is also 100% affordable development. There's supportive housing for people with special needs, and there's also preservation of existing housing. And so what has happened as a result of this? We have over 60,000 at the time of this, now over 70,000 affordable homes that have been built. There's also about 100,000 market rate homes that have been built that don't have affordability controls, that are the market rate townhouses or apartments that are part of inclusionary mixed income developments. And that has been really important in terms of, I agree that when you build more housing, that also makes the housing market more affordable for everybody. I think, the challenge is that, again, that by itself cannot impact these generational, historical, racial wealth gaps without having specific targeted affordable housing as well. And so we've managed to do both of those things. And right now through this process, there's an additional over 50,000 affordable homes in process, and also an additional over 100,000 market rate homes that are, again, the more starter homes, townhouses, apartments that would have not otherwise be permitted. And so to make some concrete, someone said they were from Princeton, they were there, right? Yeah. So do you know where that is? Any chance?
I don't.
So you know where the hospital used to be?
Yeah.
So Princeton Hospital moved to a new suburban site, and basically the hospital was knocked down, and there is an inclusionary development that was built as a result, which would have never been permitted. There would have never permitted apartments there. And the market rate rents run from a little over $2,000 to over $4,500, the affordable rents run from $580 to $1,608. And so, back to the Herman Crib analogy, I mean, you're never through creation of these homes going to create enough steps down that within Princeton itself, there's going to be affordable housing. You need that specific requirement. It might be that through a chain of reactions in Trenton, it creates more affordable housing. But when we have resources, school districts, job opportunities, transportation that are all spatially based, we just don't believe that that's good enough, that is a sufficient enough remedy. And again, it also is a much more limited political coalition. It's that in terms of pushing. This is, anyone know where Sea Caucus is? So this is next to a giant train station that was built in the late 90s that is 15 minutes from Midtown Manhattan. It connects basically all New Jersey transit lines. And this is, again, something that was not previously permitted through zoning. It's a new, about 2,000 apartments. And again, same thing. There's no way that if you just threw, kind of a trickle-down market approach, that you would have affordable units next to this train station with great access into Manhattan and other places in New Jersey. But by combining the upzoning with an inclusionary requirement, you're able to have a mix of the market rate and affordable rents, and these just have great job access and educational access. The other thing we've done is that we've really, there's significant amounts, not as much as there used to be, but of federal funding that goes towards building new affordable housing. And we've integrated that in New Jersey fairly uniquely. There's not many other states that have really done this effectively with this system. And this is actually affordable housing. So the ultimate result of that lawsuit over 36 apartments was that actually there were 140 apartments that were built in Mount Laurel. And they were named for the original plaintiff, Ethel Lawrence. And there was a 5-year study by researchers at Princeton of the impacts of that, both on the people who moved there and the surrounding community. And basically they found that for people who moved there versus people who were in the housing lottery and didn't get in, because 2,400 people applied for these 140 apartments, that basically kids did much better in school. A lot of kids ended up then going to college for the first time of anyone in their family. A lot of people got better jobs because Mount Laurel is a huge job hub. It's right off the turnpike, and that proximity and sort of social networks is, a lot of research shows is really important in employment. And we've seen people been able to save up money and move out and buy houses from here. And there was no impact on the surrounding community. I mean, again, it's interesting, right? I mean, this often happens. I ask the question, people raved and ranted against this when it got to the planning board. And what they found is they surveyed residents of the surrounding developments, and most of them had no idea it was affordable housing. So, and there's been no effect on tax rates, all the things that people ran about. And so, what I think the New Jersey experience shows is that you can create significant amounts of both affordable and market rate housing through addressing these zoning issues. But if you don't do it with a deliberate, back to that previous slide, if you don't do it with a deliberate focus on affordability as part of it, you're going to end up still creating these sort of tiers and segregation between communities, where the opportunities that are created, to the degree that they trickle down to people, they may do so, 20 miles away, and still don't create, any kind of remedy for that generations of largely race-based discrimination in zoning and housing. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
I think I'll sit for my questions. So I have a few questions for you before we turn to the audience questions, based on what you've already discussed. So one of the first things I'd like to know, so a lot of the conversation, including the very slide that's up right now, deals with rents, right? Because we're talking about how much you're paying per month for these apartments, and obviously people who are renting clearly benefit from affordable rent programs. To what extent do the issues that we're discussing right now, to what extent can they be extrapolated to homeowners, and to what extent should zoning regulations and all the things that you've been talking about, should they factor in homeowners, and how, and considering concepts like owning a home being part of the American dream and things like that, how do we adopt zoning laws to help with that issue? more people own homes, for example?
Well, to talk about inclusionary zoning in particular, it's often applied to both homes that are for sale and homes that are for rent. It creates particular challenges when we're talking about inclusionary zoned houses that are for home buyers, because there's often a very limited pool of people who can both qualify for the mortgage necessary to purchase that unit and meet the income restrictions. And in the worst cases, or the cases where this policy is clearly not meeting its intentions, we see people who are very high wealth but low income benefiting from these houses rather than the intended beneficiaries. Talking more generally, the policies that restrict housing construction and thereby increase the cost of housing have similar effects on both rent and prices. But we tend to see a divergence between rent and prices in the most constrained markets. The price to rent ratio in high cost coastal cities is much higher than in lower cost markets where housing is more abundant. So while rents are a problem in those high cost cities, home ownership can be really out of reach for low and middle income households.
Yeah, one of the things that I think, and it touches on some things Emily said before, that I think is not studied enough is sort of all of the different kinds of differences from state to state of the kinds of things zoning regulates and does not. Not only does inclusionary zoning in New Jersey not generally distinguish between rental and for sale, but also, as a matter of state law, you can't zone for tenure. You can't say that certain units have to be for rental or for sale. And there's a lot of other rules like that in New Jersey that have developed sort of, alongside Mount Laurel that I think are really important that sort of limit the kind of overreaching regulation by local governments of zoning. There's a lot of, another thing that differs from state to state is sort of impact fees and you have states where developers say, where municipalities say, well, you're gonna have to build us a school if you do this. That's illegal in New Jersey, you can't do that. And so, I think it's an important point that it's not just about single family zoning, or it's about this sort of whole ecosystem of rules about what is and isn't permissible to regulate by zoning. I think in terms of the, I agree with Emily that a real challenge for inclusionary or really any kind of affordable home ownership can be a mix of, credit and having down payment. We've really tried to work on that by pairing inclusionary home ownership with down payment assistance programs, and that's been fairly successful. We also have specific rules in New Jersey in terms of the wealth point, which is a really important one, that look at both income and wealth. So if you have above a certain amount of assets, you don't qualify for affordable housing in terms of inclusionary home ownership. But because we don't have zoning by tenure, a lot of it is based on what the market is. And right now in New Jersey, the market is very rental driven. And the last thing I'll say is in terms of talking about the federal subsidies are overwhelmingly for rental housing. And I think that there's an interesting debate about, that from a policy perspective. Working on this at a state level, we're kind of dealing with what we're handed, but there's just far more subsidy for rental housing than there is for home ownership. So, I do think it's really important. It's something we work on a lot policy-wise, trying to promote more first time and really first generation home ownership. And I think it's also important to recognize that not everybody is ready to own a home or wants to own a home.
Thank you so much. Another question that I have deals with bringing it slightly more into the theme of TPIC Public Interest Week overall, which is the effect of COVID on the economy and people's income. And so COVID has clearly had a massive effect on many people's lives, on their livelihoods as well. And we have seen certainly an increase in the permanence of homelessness. So more people a greater number of people are now homeless for longer periods of time. We've also seen people often losing their jobs and their sources of income. if there hasn't been necessarily effect on people not being able to pay their mortgage or their rent, it may largely be due to subsidies from the government, which may not be eternal. So this might end, and most people might face the same exact problems. So obviously there have been eviction moratoria and things like that passed, but are there any long-term policies being taken up by now, either by municipalities, states, the federal government, that would address this issue and the inequities created by COVID from a long-term policy level, particularly related to zoning? And if not, do you think there should be?
So I think it's a great question, and we have been particularly impacted in New Jersey because we have all these people from Philly and especially from New York who've been moving to New Jersey, so our housing market is crazy. I mean, just absolutely crazy, and we have been really pointed out as a reason, to look at both short-term issues, which we've been involved in terms of issues like eviction moratoria, but also the longer-term things. I mean, what we're seeing in New Jersey, which is fascinating, is it's sort of an accident of the timing, is because the Mount Laurel process was really restarted in 2015, and because we're seeing this housing market boom, what we're actually seeing is that, New Jersey will have more multifamily building permits this year probably than at any time in the entire state's history. And that's because of this process intersecting with the craziness of the market that's been driven by COVID. I do also think that a lot of people are homeless ultimately because of exclusionary land use practices. There's a lot of I mean, obviously there are people for whom that's not true who are going to be homeless anywhere, but a lot of homelessness is people who might be able to pay like $750 a month for rent, and if there's nowhere in an entire area that has that, then you're going to become homeless. Whereas that's not true everywhere necessarily. So, I would hope that we certainly in New Jersey have been talking about how this should impact longer term issues, and I would hope that I think that it also seems like at the federal level there's more discussion going on about housing resources, and there's some discussion on exclusionary zoning. And so, I mean, we at least are really supportive of trying to get the additional funding that's in the Build Back Better proposal, and think that would be helpful. But I do think it is an opportunity to talk more about exclusionary zoning.
Yes, as Adam said, COVID and remote work have led to really big shifts in demand for where people want to live. And so the pandemic has shown a light on the problems of exclusionary zoning in some suburban and rural localities where that wasn't really part of the conversation previously. So in Montana, for example, there's been a lot of proposals at the state level to address housing affordability, in large part because so many people have moved to the state during the pandemic, causing real affordability problems for some of the renters who lived there previously. I think COVID has also shown a light on some of the opportunities to look at land use regulations that address where housing can be built more so than how much housing can be built. So for example, a lot of commercial space has become obsolete as people are doing more online shopping. Strip malls are dying in some places. Office buildings are having much higher vacancy rates relative to apartment buildings. So there are opportunities to allow either reuse of some of these buildings as residential or redevelopment of residential uses in places that have been previously zoned for exclusively commercial development.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up on that. I think that those are actually much bigger opportunities than some of the sort of like, we're going to eliminate single-family zoning things. And what's interesting is that there's been a lot more resistance, I think partly because they're likely more effective. For example, Connecticut, which has this accessory apartment proposal, also had a proposal to basically upzone all the land within a certain radius of transit stations, which would include a lot of those obsolete office uses, and that faced much more resistance. I think because people knew that it was probably actually much more effective, but in terms of what we're actually seeing for how compliance works for Mount Laurel, especially in northern New Jersey, overwhelming percentage of what is going on is we don't see that much adaptive reuse. It's really tear down the older office buildings and strip malls and rebuilding them as apartment complexes or townhouses.
Great. Thank you so much for your responses. I think it's time for us to turn to the audience questions. So I know that you've been writing these on cards. So I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 of those. Yeah. Might take me a second. I'll just go. I'll just shuffle them to be fair. Sure. Yeah, that's a great idea. So we were wondering if you could provide the audience with some, common misconception or some particular aspect that people often overlook in the context of zoning law. They think it's super important for them to take away in the context of this conversation. While I look through this.
Sure. So I very much agree with one of the broad themes of Adam's comments that there is a role for providing assistance to the lowest income households to improve the quality of housing that they can afford relative to what an unregulated market alone would provide. But nonetheless, it really is exclusionary zoning that's causing the most severe problems for the lowest income households. If we look at homelessness rates across the country, often the places where poverty is most severe have very low homelessness rates because housing is abundant in the poorest parts of the country. But some of the highest wage places where economic opportunities are greatest have the highest rates of homelessness as well because their land use policies have made housing so scarce.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think also, this has been a common theme of both of our talks, but I think really looking beyond buzzwords, like things like saying, like, we're passing a bill to eliminate single-family zoning, like, that sounds great, but as Emily emphasized, if you don't actually look at what it actually does, I think there's been a lot of hype for policies that do very little, and it's unfortunately a lot of the things that really matter are much more the nuts and bolts that can be harder to explain, but are the things that are actually stopping more affordable housing from being built. And so it's probably on all of us to do a better job of explaining that, but I do think it's an area in which you could have, very symbolic, supposedly progressive policies that are passed that really are meaningless when you look at the reality.
Great. So I will now ask some of the questions from the audience, the ones I've been able to get through and were legible. Do you think there are non-economic benefits to inclusionary, and this particularly for Emily, to non-economic benefits to inclusionary zoning, for example, mitigating income segregation, thus enhancing class solidarity, increasing private aid to those in need? If so, how do you factor those non-economic benefits into your policy analysis?
That's a great question. Certainly there are benefits to the households who get those inclusionary units. And I think it's a worthwhile goal, certainly, to see more income and race-based integration across neighborhoods in the U.S. I don't think, though, that means that inclusionary zoning is the best way to get that outcome. Inclusionary zoning is very popular among local policymakers for one reason, because it doesn't require them to spend any money. It is kind of a sneaky regulatory tax that makes it look as if these units are being delivered at no cost to residents. So rather than requiring them to be built by home builders, I would like to see local or state or federal policymakers getting the outcome of inclusionary zoning by just paying for it on the books, by setting aside subsidized units in mixed income neighborhoods.
I think,
Yeah, obviously, I do think there's significant non-economic benefits. I also think that a lot of the literature on inclusionary zoning doesn't distinguish between whether it is whether it's a cost that's borne by developers or landowners, and I think it's really important. I mean, I actually think our experience in New Jersey is that it really is probably borne more by landowners, especially if it's a consistent policy over time. And I just think that landowners don't have a right to, increase valuation of their land that's often based on significant public investment. And I think that, and I see, so I think that really, especially if you have applied consistent regime over time, what you get is basically a reduction in the increase in unearned income from landowners, and I don't think that that's a bad public policy.
So another question here. To promote housing and development, zoning boards will sometimes approve variances even when the stringent statutory requirements for a variance have not been fully met. Should we encourage these legally questionable approvals because of their functional benefit, or should we focus on legislative changes that may be politically difficult to achieve?
Another really good question that Adam's more qualified to speak to than I am. From a practical standpoint, I'm inclined to say a process that relies heavily on variances or planned unit developments to get a lot of housing built is preferable to a process that doesn't allow housing to get built, either by the rules on the books or through a variance process. But on the other hand, we see a lot of corruption and unfairness in who gets those approvals in localities that where they don't go by the rules on the books for a lot of development.
So, I think I would agree with all those things. I would also say, this is another thing that's kind of like a detail that's important to recognize in Mount Laurel. You cannot have a municipality can't take credit towards the Mount Laurel obligation if the zoning that it's passed requires a variance to get something built, which I think is a very good basic policy. And I guess, the thing I'd say is, there's also very different regimes in different states on what requires a variance and how stringent the proofs need to be. And so what I would say is, I would question whether things should be requiring variances in the first place. I mean, I think a lot of things that are requiring variances really should be permitted uses, and the variance process just adds a lot of cost and it really depresses the construction of housing.
Great. Adam, I believe you touched on this lightly, but the question is, what, if anything, can be done at the federal HUD level to encourage municipalities to change zoning codes?
Well, I think that there's been this there's the Affirmative Relief for Fair Housing Rule, which was put in place in the Obama administration. The Biden administration is working on it. I think the version that was put in place by the Obama administration doesn't focus squarely enough on that, because it sort of focuses on too many things at once. Is sort of my take on it. I think it's better than nothing, but I think it would be good to improve that. I think a challenge that we have, though, frequently, especially on the coast, is that the municipalities that have the most exclusionary zoning don't really get any HUD funding, and they don't mind that they don't get any HUD funding. So I think in order for the federal government to more effectively actually, because they don't actually want affordable housing, so they don't care about HUD funding. So in order for the federal government to more effectively have a lever, I think it would have to also involve criteria for funding that localities want, such as transportation funding. That being said, I also think that there's a limit to how much the federal government realistically can do. I think that, I do think that those are kinds of things the federal government should be doing, but I also just think at the end of the day, a lot of the reform has to happen on the state and local level.
Yeah, I really agree with everything Adam said. This is another case where details really matter, and federal policymakers are failing to engage with those details. To take just one example, Senator Warren introduced a bill that would be intended to encourage zoning reform among CDBG, Community Development Block Grant recipients, with a new pot of money, but targeted to these recipients of existing Community Development Block Grants. But these are, this would totally leave out the places where exclusionary zoning is the biggest problem. So we really need policymakers at every level of government to better engage with what the real barriers to housing affordability are.
Excellent. So this is based on Emily's analogy, but I'm sure you both can answer this question. So you compare the building of high-end housing to the hermit crab shell shuffle. How should we think about the cost of the shuffle itself? Even though building affordable housing might be inefficient, doesn't it avoid some of the transaction costs associated with such a shuffle?
Sure, potentially, it could result in less need for people to move in order to get housing that better meets their needs, theoretically. But on the other hand, there are a lot of deadweight losses in current subsidized housing policy. Policymakers tend not to know, where an individual household's needs are going to be best met in terms of their commute, schools for their kids, etc. So there are lots of transaction costs and deadweight losses to subsidized housing policy as well.
I do think that's something that, well, I mean, I sort of go back to these examples, right? I mean, I think that the problem is if you're relying, I don't know, I was using this sort of a voucher-based system, is that in order for like a voucher-based system to enable people to live in Princeton, for example, you'd have to have, the problem is the very bottom of the rental market in Princeton, unless in the entire area around Princeton, 100,000 houses are built tomorrow, basically the bottom for the foreseeable future is going to be out of reach. And so I think that, we know that there's probably some subset. I mean, in fact, Princeton is very similar to Mount Laurel. It has a Black community that historically has been there for many generations and is in the process of being displaced. And basically, if you don't have something that more specifically restricts affordability, that's just going to continue to happen. And so I do think that, I don't think that the hermit crab analogy is useless. I think there's a reality that you do need to increase supply, and it has huge impacts on the housing market overall. I think it's sort of a necessary but not sufficient, approach to housing policy.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. This one's might be a little tough. It's tough for me to read. In 2017, wealth from housing accounted for roughly 30 to 40% of homeowners' assets. If we could go back to the drawing board, and we might prefer a different system where people save money using a more diverse set of assets. But we don't live in that world. How do homeowner interests fit into the broader debate over housing justice?
The politics of land use reform are so difficult in part because this is such an important piece of wealth for so many households. I very much agree that with the premise of the question that it would be a better world if people were not so reliant on the place where they live as a key source of their savings. And it makes it really difficult to pass reforms in a place like Los Angeles, where if we do enough deregulation, people who bought their houses within the last so many years are going to take a real hit to their finances because of this deregulation. It's kind of similar to what happened to taxi medallion holders in New York City with the entrance of ride sharing to the city. They had this asset that was valuable because of its scarcity that lost a ton of value when it was no longer so scarce. And the pool of homeowners is much, much larger, of course, than the pool of medallion holders. So it's a real challenge. And until, say, the last few years, I was very pessimistic about zoning reform in the U.S. because of that reality. But in spite of those difficult politics, we have seen a lot of reform activity and reforms picking up just within the last few years.
Yeah, I think that's all well stated, and and I think I think it's hard to state that I do think it would be better if we had a different system for wealth generation, but we don't have that, and I do think obviously it would be better if, you know, the historic access to that system of generating wealth was not so, you know, incredibly stilted by race, but it is. And so it's impossible to sort of separate, I think, you know, the sort of people protecting their home values is also protecting racial wealth gap that we have. And in fact, that gap is often the strongest in the places that have the most exclusionary zoning. I mean, I think that, you know, I also think it's also important to have, like, the set of homeowner interests are partly economic, but also partly about preserving a sense that, you know, this place should be exactly as it is when I moved in, which often does have an element of being about race, and often is also just, I mean, just incredible to me, the town I live in, which is a fairly racially and economically diverse town, Collingswood, New Jersey. There's a proposal for 120 new apartments, which would have an affordable component of about 4 blocks from my house. And just the way people are, say, this is not the character of Collingswood. I mean, this is a town that has, you know, 9-story apartment buildings. I mean, and people still are just sort of have this mentality that, you know, any kind of change is just not what they expect, even in a town that literally has a 9-story apartment building. And so I just think that there are powerful economic incentives, and there's also, on top of that, these very powerful non-economic incentives, and so it's very hard to overcome, and yet I am encouraged that there's more and more focus on people addressing it.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. I'm really thankful. I think our whole chapter and Penn Law is very thankful that you came here and engaged in this productive dialogue and educated us. Me personally, because I don't know anything about land use laws, was extremely educational. I hope a lot of people in the audience feel the same way. As a reminder, this is recorded and it will be shared with the attendees afterwards. I believe lunch is right outside here. Thank you all very much.
And if I just can say, we love to have interns from Penn, externs, and you know, we're also always looking for fellows. So anyone who's interested in that, we're not that far away, and even less so in the virtual space. So our office is 10 minutes from Center City. So you know, anyone with interest would love to talk to you about that. Thanks a lot for having us. Yeah, thank you. It's great to meet you too. Yeah.